The message came on a Tuesday. Not a dramatic Tuesday. Not the kind of Tuesday that people write poems about or remember forever. It was the kind of Tuesday where the coffee was lukewarm, the traffic was bad, and most people on Earth were doing exactly what they always did, complaining about their bosses, scrolling through their phones and wondering what to make for dinner. But in a small, windowless room buried deep inside the United Nations headquarters in New York City, 12 people sat around a table and stared at a screen that had just changed everything. Commander Maya Chin pressed her fingers flat against the cold metal surface of the table and read the message for the fourth time. She read it slowly. She read every single word. She needed to be sure she was not misreading it. She needed to be sure that 20 years of working in the Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs had not finally broken her ability to process information correctly. But no. The words were clear. The translation software confirmed it. The signal had been verified by 47 independent listening stations across the planet. The message said, "To the biological organisms of the third planet in the Sol system. You have been observed. You have been evaluated. The Galactic Council extends a formal invitation for your species to attend the 4112th session of the Interstellar Assembly, to be held at the Varith Station, located in neutral space beyond your outer planetary boundary. 1 vessel. 10 representatives. You have 30 of your planetary rotations to respond. Failure to respond will be noted in the permanent record." That was it. No warmth. No congratulations. No, welcome to the family of civilized species. Just a cold, administrative message that felt less like an invitation and more like a summons. Maya leaned back in her chair and looked at the 11 other people around the table. She saw the same expression on every single face. It was not joy. It was not fear exactly. It was something more complicated than both of those things combined. It was the expression of people who had spent their entire professional lives preparing for a moment and had suddenly realized, now that the moment was actually here, that no amount of preparation could have ever been enough. 30 days, said Dr. James Okafor, the director of First Contact Protocols. He was a tall Nigerian-American man with silver at his temples and reading glasses that he never seemed to actually use for reading. He just held them always, like a prop that made him feel more in control of situations. They give us 30 days to decide whether to send representatives to a council that includes, how many species are we estimating? Between 40 and 200, said Dr. Priya Nair, the chief xenolinguistics officer. She was the one who had decoded the message. She looked like she had not slept in 3 days, which was accurate. We don't know the exact number. The signal structure suggests the council has been operating for a very long time. The number 4112 in the session count? If each session is roughly equivalent to a standard cycle of some kind, we could be talking about thousands of years of organized interstellar governance. Thousands of years, repeated General Howard Briggs, the military liaison. He was a broad man with a face like a cliff and the personality of someone who had seen too much of the world to be surprised by very much anymore. He had thick gray eyebrows that moved independently of each other when he was thinking, and right now they were doing complicated gymnastics across his forehead. And they're only inviting us now. They said we've been observed, Maya said. They've been watching us. For how long? James asked. Nobody answered because nobody knew, and the silence that filled the room in response to that question was the kind of silence that makes a person feel very, very small. Maya thought about that. She thought about everything humanity had done in the time it might have been observed. The wars. The environmental damage. The centuries of cruelty and brilliance and stupidity and beauty all mixed together into the messy, contradictory species that humans were. She wondered what watching humanity looked like from the outside. She suspected it was not flattering. "We go," she said finally. Every head turned toward her. "We have to go," she continued. "Not going isn't really an option. They said failure to respond will be noted in the permanent record. That's a threat dressed up as a bureaucratic statement. If we don't show up, we lose any chance of shaping whatever they decide about us." "They could already have decided," General Briggs said. "Then we go and we find out," Maya said. "And if they've decided something we don't like, we make them understand that their decision needs to be reconsidered." General Briggs looked at her for a long moment. Then one corner of his mouth moved in a way that might have been a smile if it had tried a little harder. "Fair enough," he said. The next 30 days were the most intense of Maya's life, and she had once spent 6 months in an underwater research station in the Arctic with a broken heating system, so that was saying something. Every government on Earth was notified. The information was classified at the highest possible level for exactly 48 hours before someone leaked it, because information that's significant cannot be contained, not in a world of billions of people and smartphones and satellites. Once it leaked, the response was exactly what anyone with any understanding of humanity should have predicted. Complete and total chaos. Some people celebrated in the streets. Some people panicked. Several governments demanded to be included in the delegation. Several religious groups declared it the beginning of the end times, which, to be fair, several religious groups declared about most significant news events, so that was not particularly surprising. Financial markets crashed and then rebounded and then crashed again. People bought survival supplies and also, for reasons that were hard to explain, an enormous amount of novelty alien merchandise. T-shirts, coffee mugs, hats. The human response to existential uncertainty apparently included a strong desire to put cartoon aliens on household items. Maya worked through all of it. She worked 18-hour days selecting the delegation. She worked with every space agency on the planet to identify which vessel would make the journey. She worked with xenolinguistics teams to build translation protocols, with behavioral psychologists to prepare the representatives for the unknown, with military advisors to understand what the threat assessment looked like. The vessel they chose was called the Meridian. It was a research and exploration ship, not a military one. That was a deliberate choice. They wanted to arrive looking like scientists, not soldiers. They wanted to arrive looking like people who were curious about the universe, not people who were ready to fight it. The delegation of 10 was assembled after fierce negotiation among the world's nations. Maya was appointed as lead representative, which felt both like an honor and like being handed a live grenade and told to juggle it. The others were a mix of scientists, diplomats, a military observer who was technically there as security staff, and one person whose inclusion had been insisted upon by a coalition of smaller nations and whose official title was cultural ambassador, which meant she was there to remind everyone that humanity was more than just governments and generals. Her name was Sofia Reyes. She was a 42-year-old poet and historian from Mexico City who had written 3 books about the nature of human identity across cultures. She had large dark eyes that seemed to be constantly finding something interesting to look at, and she asked more questions per hour than anyone Maya had ever met. Sophia sat next to Maya on the shuttle that carried them up to the Meridian on the morning of departure, and she said, "Do you think they're going to like us?" Maya looked out the window at the earth falling away beneath them. She thought about that question very carefully. "I think," she said slowly, "that we should focus less on being liked and more on being understood." Sophia considered this. "Those things are often the same," she said. "With humans maybe," Maya replied. "We don't know yet what they are with everyone else." The journey to Verith Station took 11 days. The Meridian was fast, faster than anything humanity had built before, running on a propulsion system that 3 different research teams had independently developed over the past decade using principles that the scientific community was still arguing about. It worked, which was the important part. The physics could be debated later. The 11 days felt both very long and very short. Long because space at close range is beautiful but monotonous. The stars did not move the way people imagine stars move when they think about space travel. They hung there, fixed and ancient, like lights in a ceiling that was too high to ever reach. The crew occupied themselves with preparation drills, language studies, and what Maya could only describe as controlled anxious energy, the kind of focused tension that comes from being very professionally prepared and very humanly terrified at the same time. Short because, when Maya lay in her bunk at night and thought about what was waiting at the end of the journey, 11 days felt like nothing at all. Like a single breath before diving into water of unknown depth. On the 9th day they received a second communication. It came in the same format as the first, cold, administrative, precise. It provided coordinates for docking at Verith Station and a list of behavioral protocols expected of visiting delegations. The protocols were extensive. No aggressive physical displays. No loud vocalizations. No sudden movements in the presence of council members. All technology to be declared upon arrival. All biological samples, meaning themselves, to be registered and catalogued. All communications to go through official translation channels. Dr. Nair read through the protocols twice and then said very quietly, "They're treating us like animals being brought into a controlled environment." Nobody argued with her, because nobody could find a reasonable argument against that observation. "We follow the protocols," Maya said. "All of them." "Exactly. We don't give them any reason to see us as a problem before we've even had a chance to speak." "And if the protocols themselves are a problem?" asked Colonel Daniel Park, their military observer. He was a quiet Korean-American man who asked precise questions at precise moments and was therefore one of the most useful people Maya had ever worked with. "Then we note the problem," Maya said, "and we deal with it through the proper channels." "And if there are no proper channels?" Daniel asked. Maya looked at him steadily. "Then we create them," she said. Verith Station appeared on the view screen on the morning of the 11th day, and every single person on the Meridian went silent. It was enormous. Not enormous in the way that large human-built things are enormous. The way a skyscraper or an aircraft carrier is enormous, where you can still see all of it at once and comprehend its scale with your eyes. It was enormous in the way that a mountain range is enormous, or an ocean. Something so large that the eye cannot fully process it, something that your brain looks at and says, this should not exist at this scale, and yet here it is. It was a constructed object approximately the size of a small moon. It had layers, visible levels of structure that extended outward in concentric rings, each ring slightly different in material and texture and the color of the lights that ran along its surface. Some sections were dark and metallic. Some glowed with a deep blue that felt organic somehow, like bioluminescence. Some sections were transparent, and through them shapes moved, ships, structures, things that Maya could not categorize from this distance. Around it, traffic moved in organized streams. Ships of dozens of different designs and sizes approached and departed in what was clearly a carefully managed system. Some of the ships were recognizable as ships in a general sense: propulsion, hull, directionality. Others were shapes that Maya's brain struggled to file under any familiar category. There are at least 40 distinct vessel types visible, said Lieutenant Arya Santos, the Meridian's chief sensor officer, reading from her display. I'm detecting life sign signatures from at least, she paused. She recalibrated. She paused again. From at least 32 different biological profiles. 32 different species. In one place. HFY, Sophia said softly from behind Maya. She had learned the phrase from Maya during the journey. It was something Maya said when she needed to center herself, a private marker of commitment, of resolve. HFY, from this moment it falls to me. Sophia had adopted it as her own way of marking significant moments. Maya did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the station. Open the docking channel, she said to the communications officer. Tell them the Meridian has arrived. Tell them humanity is here. Vera Station smelled like nothing. That was the first thing Maya noticed when they stepped through the docking seal and into the station's receiving corridor. She had expected something, some alien chemistry, some foreign biology, some hint of the dozens of species that called this place home. Instead, the air was completely neutral. Filtered to a degree that removed not just contamination but apparently any olfactory characteristic at all. It felt, in a strange way, like breathing inside a photograph. The receiving corridor itself was tall and wide, built, clearly, to accommodate species of various sizes. The walls were a smooth composite material in a color that Maya's brain kept filing as gray, even though it was not quite any gray she had seen before. The lighting came from strips embedded in the floor and ceiling rather than from any visible source, creating an even, shadowless illumination that felt slightly wrong to human eyes, which were built for environments with defined light sources. Waiting for them at the end of the corridor was their assigned liaison. It, was approximately 7 feet tall, bipedal, with 4 arms, 2 of which were folded across what might have been a chest and 2 of which hung at his sides. His skin was a deep charcoal color with faint geometric patterns running across it that might have been natural markings or might have been something applied. He had a wide, flat face with 3 large eyes arranged in a triangle, 2 where a human would expect eyes and 1 centered above the bridge of a nose that was more of a ridge than a protrusion. His mouth, when he opened it, had multiple layered structures inside that Maya's brain categorized as not quite lips, not quite teeth, something else entirely. He spoke. The translation device, a small unit that each delegation member wore behind their left ear, rendered his words after a half-second delay. I am Coordinator Velsath of the Theron Collective. I have been assigned as liaison for the Sol 3 delegation for the duration of the 4112th session. You will follow me. You will not deviate from the designated pathway. You will not initiate contact with other species without my supervision. You will not operate any technology rated above Class 1 without prior authorization. He turned and began walking without waiting for a response. Maya looked at her team. They looked back at her. She gave a small nod, follow, comply, observe, and they followed. The interior of Vera Station was, in the precise scientific sense of the word, overwhelming. The corridors they moved through expanded and contracted as they went deeper into the station, moving from the relatively contained receiving areas into spaces that opened into vast atria, interior spaces so large that they had their own weather systems, visible condensation forming at upper levels and drifting in slow curling wisps that were not quite clouds but were not quite not clouds either. Other species moved through these spaces. Maya tried not to stare. She failed repeatedly. She was fairly certain everyone on the team failed repeatedly. There were beings that walked on 6 legs with bodies like elongated shells. There were beings that floated in enclosed transparent pods filled with a liquid that was not water but served the same purpose. There were beings that were approximately human-shaped but with skin that moved independently of their bodies, not in a disturbing way exactly but in a way that suggested the skin itself was doing something, processing something, communicating something that Maya could not read. There were beings so small that they traveled in clusters of hundreds, moving in synchronized formations like a school of fish made of light. There were beings so large that the corridors had a separate higher level built specifically for them, and they moved along it like slow, magnificent storms. "Don't fall behind," Coordinator Velsath said without turning around, and the translation came with what Maya was fairly certain was a tone of mild contempt, though she noted carefully that she could be wrong about that. Cross-species emotional tone was exactly the kind of thing she could be wrong about. They reached the council chamber after 20 minutes of walking. The chamber was circular and vast. The seating was arranged in concentric rings rising upward from a central floor space. Hundreds of positions for hundreds of representatives, each position adapted for a different physiology. Some seats were chairs in a recognizable sense. Some were flat platforms. Some were frames that species could wrap around or float beside or press against. The chamber was designed to include everyone, which was, Maya thought, a more impressive engineering achievement than the physical scale of the station itself. The central floor space was currently occupied by what appeared to be a debate in progress. Two species were presenting: a tall, branching species that looked vaguely like walking coral reefs, and a dense, compact species with thick armored plating and short, powerful limbs. The debate was being conducted through the station's translation system, which meant that every species in the chamber was hearing it in their own language simultaneously. Velsath led the delegation to a section of seating near the lower middle of the chamber, not quite at the bottom, not anywhere near the top. Maya filed that placement away as information. Where you sat in a hierarchical space was always information. "You will observe the current session," Velsath said. "When the Sol 3 delegation is called, you will proceed to the central floor. You will present your credentials. You will answer questions from council members. You will then return to your seats and wait for the council's determination." "What kind of determination?" Maya asked. Velsath's 3 eyes focused on her in a way that Maya could not entirely read. "The standard determination for newly contacted species," he said. "Classification. Status assignment. Protocol designation." "What are the possible classifications?" she asked. There was a pause. A pause that lasted just a fraction of a second too long. "That will be discussed during the session," Velsath said and turned away. Maya sat down. She looked at Daniel, who was sitting beside her. He gave her a look that said, "I noticed the pause too." She gave him a look back that said, "I know." They observed for 2 hours before the Sol 3 delegation was called. In those 2 hours, Maya learned more about interstellar politics than she had in 20 years of professional study, because no amount of theoretical preparation compares to watching the thing itself happen in real time. The Galactic Council, she observed, was not a democracy. It was not a dictatorship either. It was something more complicated, a hierarchy of influence and recognition, where the oldest and most powerful species held the most weight, but where alliances and coalitions could shift the balance of any given decision. It was, in many ways, not entirely unlike the United Nations, which was both reassuring and deeply concerning, because Maya knew exactly how much the United Nations could accomplish when its most powerful members disagreed, which was not very much. She watched species argue. She watched alliances form in real time through a series of signals she was only beginning to learn to read. She watched the coral reef species make a point that appeared to be devastating. Every translator in the chamber went silent for a full 3 seconds after it landed, which she was learning was the interstellar equivalent of a stunned audience. She watched and she catalogued and she prepared. When the call came, "Sol 3 delegation, proceed to the central floor," she stood up, straightened her jacket, and walked down to the center of the largest room she had ever been in front of more alien species than she had known existed 40 days ago, and she stood there and she was ready. Or she was as ready as a human being can be for something that has never happened before. Which is to say, she was terrified and she was doing it anyway. Which is, perhaps, the most human form of ready there is. The questions began immediately. The first species to speak was one Maya had mentally labeled the Veth. She had heard the name used twice in the past 2 hours. They were tall, thin beings with elongated heads and a coloration that shifted between deep purple and dark blue depending on what angle you viewed them from. Their voice, through the translator, was smooth and precise. "Sol 3 organisms," the Veth representative said. "You are here as a preliminary step to formal classification. We have observed your species for 112 of your planetary years. We have compiled a comprehensive assessment. Before this assessment is presented, you are permitted to make an opening statement. You have," a pause, a consultation with something off-screen, The equivalent of 7 of your minutes. 7 minutes. To introduce humanity to the galaxy. Maya stepped forward. She had prepared for this. She had written and rewritten and practiced what she was about to say until the words felt like part of her own breathing. She spoke. She told them that humanity was a young species. Young by any interstellar measure, barely 200,000 years of existence, barely 10,000 years of recorded civilization, barely 200 years of industrial technology, barely 70 years of space exploration. She told them that humanity was complicated, capable of tremendous cruelty and tremendous compassion, sometimes in the same generation, sometimes in the same person. She told them that humanity was curious, that the drive to understand the universe was not a project or a program for humans but something more fundamental, something written into the species' basic character. She told them that humanity had come here in peace, with open hands ready to learn. She finished. She stepped back. The chamber was quiet. Then the Veth representative said, "Thank you. The council will now present its assessment." And everything changed. The assessment was delivered by a species Maya had not focused on before. A species seated near the top of the chamber, in positions that suggested significant authority. They were called the Kreth, the translator informed her when they began speaking, and their physical appearance was striking. Massive, dark-scaled beings with wide, flat heads and eyes that caught the chamber's light and reflected it in a way that made them look constantly illuminated from within. The Kreth representative stood. Every translator in the chamber went to a kind of quiet readiness. The conversational noise between species that had been constant background sound since Maya arrived suddenly dropped. The council has reviewed the assessment of the sole 3 organisms, the Kreth representative said. His voice, through the translator, was deep and carrying. 112 years of observation have produced the following profile. He listed it. Militarily active. The humans had fought hundreds of wars within recorded history, including 2 conflicts that consumed their entire planet simultaneously. Technologically accelerating. The rate of technological development over the past 2 centuries was classified as anomalous by the Council's standard metrics, meaning it exceeded the expected development curve by a factor that warranted special notation. Biologically, and here the Kreth representative used a phrase that Maya's translator rendered as biologically hyperadaptive. Capable of surviving in conditions that would be lethal to most assessed species. Resistant to disease at a rate that exceeded most known biological models. Capable of recovering from injuries that would be permanently debilitating or fatal in comparative species. Additionally, the Kreth representative continued, the sole 3 organisms have demonstrated a behavioral pattern not commonly observed in developing species. They have an anomalous relationship with their own mortality. Observed subjects have repeatedly, voluntarily, entered situations of extreme physical danger for reasons that our behavioral modeling has been unable to fully account for. 4 goals. 4 principles. For other members of their group. And in several documented instances, another pause, another wait, for complete strangers. The chamber was very quiet. Based on this assessment, the Kreth representative said, the council proposes the following classification for the sole 3 organisms. Maya waited. Class 7 prey species. The words hit her like something physical. Prey. Not developing species. Not emerging civilization. Not probationary members. Not any of the categories she had been briefed on, any of the classifications her team had anticipated. Prey. She heard the word processed through the chamber's translation system into dozens of languages, and she heard, in that moment, something she had not expected to hear. Laughter. Not all species. Not even most species. But some. A sound that her translator flagged as amusement vocalization, coming from several sections of the chamber, from species who apparently found something funny about this moment. Maya stood very still. She breathed. She thought about what she knew. A Class 7 prey species, based on the briefing materials she had received from the one council document that had been transmitted to them with the invitation, meant a species that was recognized as sentient but assessed as not posing a significant competitive or military threat to established council members, and therefore eligible for. The diplomatic language had been thick and formal, but the meaning was clear, eligible for resource extraction, territorial displacement, and managed population control by species with higher classification status. It meant they could be hunted. It meant the council had just decided, in front of representatives of 40-plus civilizations, that human beings were fair game. Maya breathed. She thought of a word. A word that had no perfect translation in any alien language, a word that had been used throughout human history as both a battle cry and a quiet, internal declaration of refusal. No. She stepped forward. I would like to respond, she said. The Kreth representative looked down at her from his elevated position. His internal light eyes were steady and unreadable. The assessment period has concluded, he said. Classification is. I would like to respond, Maya said again. Her voice was level. It did not shake. She was very proud of that because every other part of her wanted to. A murmur through the chamber. Velsath, from somewhere behind her, said something urgent that her translator caught as protocol violation and inadvisable. Under what article of council procedure, said a voice from the chamber that Maya did not immediately identify, is the assessed delegation prohibited from responding to their own classification? Silence. Maya did not look for the voice. She kept her eyes on the Kreth representative. Article 44, said another voice, calm, measured, coming from a section she could not see. The assessed delegation has the right of response before classification is finalized. The vote has not occurred. The response right stands. More murmuring. The Kreth representative was still for a long moment. You have, he said finally in a tone that managed to communicate both procedural compliance and absolute disinterest, 3 of your minutes. 3 minutes. Maya thought about every war humans had ever fought. She thought about the ones that should not have been fought and the ones that absolutely had to be. She thought about every time a human being had stood in front of something much larger and more powerful than themselves and had refused, simply refused, to accept the outcome being offered. She thought about what humanity was. And then she spoke. My name is Commander Maya Chen, she said. I represent the species you have just classified as prey. She let that word sit in the air for a moment. I want to be clear about something, she continued. I am not here to beg for a different classification. I am not here to apologize for what my species is. I am here to tell you clearly and precisely what you have made a mistake about, and to give you the opportunity to correct that mistake before it becomes something much more serious than a mistake. The chamber was very quiet. You have observed us for 112 years, Maya said. And in that time you noted that we fight wars. You noted that we are biologically resilient. You noted that we have an unusual relationship with danger and death. And from those observations, you concluded that we are prey. She paused. You observed the right things, she said. And you drew the completely wrong conclusions from them. She turned slightly, addressing not just the Kreth representative but the full circle of the chamber, speaking to every species present. You saw that we fight each other, she said, and you concluded that this makes us dangerous to ourselves but manageable by others. What you missed is why we fight. We fight because we disagree. We fight because we believe things deeply enough to die for them. We fight because we are a species that does not accept, at a fundamental biological and psychological level, the idea that a situation is fixed and cannot be changed. We fight because we have never, not once in our entire history, collectively agreed that something was impossible and left it at that. She took a breath. You noted that we willingly enter danger for strangers, she said. You said your behavioral models couldn't account for it. I'll account for it for you right now. We do it because we understand something that apparently your observation did not pick up, perhaps because it is difficult to observe from a distance. We understand that every stranger is a potential ally. We understand that the investment in someone else's survival is an investment in the survival of the group. We understand, at a level that is not strategic but instinctive, that the strength of a species is not measured by the strength of its strongest members. It is measured by what its weakest members can survive. She looked up at the Kreth representative. You classified us as prey, she said, based on the assumption that our conflicts in our biology mean we are manageable. I want to tell you what that assessment missed. It missed that every war we have ever fought has made us better at fighting. It missed that every disease that has tried to kill us has made us harder to kill. It missed that every time something in our environment has tried to end us, we have adapted, overcome, and in many cases, turned the threat itself into a tool. She stopped. She let everything she had said sit in the air. Then she said the last part. The part she had not planned. The part that came from somewhere deeper than planning. We are not prey, she said quietly. We have never been prey. And the species that tries to treat us as prey will discover something that 112 years of observation from a safe distance cannot prepare them for. What is that? Said a voice from the chamber. Not the Kreth. Someone else. Several someones. She could hear the murmur of translation happening in real time, the question coming from multiple locations simultaneously. Maya looked up at the chamber. They will discover, she said, that humans do not run. The silence lasted for 7 seconds. Maya counted them. Counting was something to do with the part of her brain that wanted to panic, and giving it a job kept it busy. 7 seconds of silence in a chamber that held representatives of dozens of civilizations is a very significant silence. Maya did not have enough cultural context to know exactly what it meant in every case, but she knew enough to know it meant something. Then the debate began. It was immediate and intense. Multiple species were speaking at once, the translation system struggling to keep up, flagging priority voices and rendering lower priority commentary as soft background text on Maya's translation display. She caught fragments, unprecedented response, behavioral anomaly confirmed, the assessment protocols are adequate, the assessment protocols are clearly not adequate, this changes nothing, this changes the classification question entirely. The Kreth representative said nothing for a long moment. He watched the debate with his illuminated eyes. Then he raised one hand, a gesture that apparently carried the weight of authority in this chamber, because the debate dropped in volume immediately, and he said, "The classification vote will be delayed pending extended review. The Sol 3 delegation will be confined to their assigned quarters for the duration of deliberation." Confined? Maya said. "Standard protocol for assessed species during deliberation," Velsath said from behind her, appearing as if from nowhere in the way that he had a habit of doing that Maya found deeply unsettling. "Please, come with me." Maya looked back at the chamber one more time. She caught, in that moment, something she had not expected to see. In one of the upper sections, a species she had not been able to clearly observe before was watching her. They were sleek in silver gray, with an upright posture and eyes that were, she thought, tracking her with something that was not the cold assessment she had seen in most of the chamber. It looked almost like interest. She filed that away. Then she followed Velsath. The quarters assigned to the Sol 3 delegation were functional and carefully, pointedly modest. 4 rooms connected by a central space. Sleeping platforms with adjustable surfaces. Someone had, at least, made the effort to configure them for human physiology. A nutrition station stocked with provisions that were nutritionally compatible but texturally challenging. Atmospheric controls set to something close to Earth standard. The door, once they were inside, locked from the outside. Maya stood in the center of the main room and looked at her team. They looked back at her. There was a moment of shared silence that held about 14 different emotions simultaneously. Then Daniel said, "Well, that went about as well as it could have, given the circumstances." "They called us prey," said Dr. Nair. Her voice was flat and careful in the way that voices get when they are managing something large underneath. In front of the entire assembled galactic community. "They called us prey." "And then Maya told them exactly what they'd made a mistake about," said Sophia. She was sitting on the edge of one of the sleeping platforms, her large eyes steady and thoughtful. "That was the most important speech I've ever heard. And I study speeches for a living." "The question is whether it mattered," Daniel said. He was already running calculations on a handheld device, his military mind going directly to the operational analysis. "We don't know what a delayed vote means in terms of timeline. We don't know what the extended review will look like. We don't know which species are in favor of changing the classification and which are pushing to keep it. We know one thing," Maya said. Everyone looked at her. "We know that at least 2 species in that chamber pushed back on the classification," she said. "Someone invoked Article 44 for us. Someone else confirmed the ruling. Those were not the same voice. Which means we have at least 2 potential allies in there." "Potential," Daniel said. "Everything is potential right now," Maya said. "The question is what we do with the time we have while they deliberate." "We're locked in," Dr. Nair pointed out. "The door is locked," Maya agreed. "But I noticed something before we left the chamber. The ventilation system in this section of the station is external to the wall structure. There are maintenance access points every 30 meters along the corridor. And Coordinator Velsath's station assignment, based on the insignia I noted on the corridor junction panels, puts him approximately 200 meters north of our position." Silence. "You're suggesting we break out?" Daniel asked. "I'm suggesting," Maya said, "that we take advantage of the fact that a species that has spent 112 years observing us from a distance may have underestimated how much we notice when we're paying attention." She looked at Daniel. "I want to talk to whoever invoked Article 44, she said. "And I want to do it before the deliberation concludes." Daniel held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "I'll look at the maintenance access point." The species that had invoked Article 44 were called the Ethon. Maya learned this from the data terminal in their quarters, a piece of station technology that was accessible to visiting delegations, presumably because the information it contained was judged safe for them to see. She spent 3 hours going through everything the terminal offered on council members while Daniel worked on the access point, and the rest of the team either rested or, in Sophia's case, wrote in a small notebook she had brought with her and which she claimed was for processing. The Ethon were one of the older species in the council. Their membership dated back approximately 3,000 years, which put them solidly in the mid-tier of the Council's historical hierarchy. They were bipedal, silver-gray, humanoid in a very general sense. 2 arms, 2 legs, upright posture, though the similarities ended there. They were known as traders, diplomats, and, the record noted with what felt like bureaucratic disapproval, as frequent advocates for non-standard species classifications. Non-standard species classifications. Meaning, they had a history of pushing back on the Council's judgment about how newly contacted species should be treated. Maya sat back from the terminal. She thought about the Ethon representative she had seen in the chamber, the silver-gray figure who had watched her with something that looked like interest. She thought about the timing of Article 44 being invoked. The speed of it. Like someone who had been waiting for an opportunity. "Daniel," she said. "Almost," he said from the access panel in the far wall. 20 minutes later, they were in the corridor. The maintenance corridors of Vareth Station were narrow, functional, and, crucially, not monitored by the same surveillance system as the public areas. Maya had deduced this from the terminal data. The maintenance infrastructure was managed by a separate administrative division, and the delegation monitoring protocols applied to registered pathways, not service routes. She was making an educated guess. She was fairly good at educated guesses. The 5 of them, Maya, Daniel, Sophia, Dr. Nair, and Dr. Okafor, who had insisted on coming with a firmness that Maya respected, moved through the service corridor following the station schematic that Dr. Nair had mapped from the terminal data. The corridor was tight for humans, which meant it had been built for something smaller, which meant it was less likely to be actively used by most of the species they had seen in the public areas. This proved accurate. They moved without encountering anyone. The service corridor connected to a junction point that, according to Dr. Nair's mapping, was adjacent to the delegation quarters section used by council members of mid-tier status. Mid-tier. Where the Ethon would be. "This is either very smart or very catastrophic," Dr. Okafor said quietly as they moved. "Those are often the same thing in the beginning," Maya said. "That is both inspiring and not at all reassuring," he replied. They emerged through a maintenance access point into a secondary corridor, wider than the service route, cleaner, with the same shadowless lighting of the main station. The corridor was empty. Numbers and symbols on the doors were in the station's administrative script, which Dr. Nair could read with moderate confidence. "Ethon delegation is," Dr. Nair scanned the doors, moving slowly. "Should be the 4th, no 5th. 3rd, said a voice behind them. Maya turned. Standing at the open door of the 3rd room was the Ethon representative from the chamber. Up close, Maya's translator had now picked up enough contextual markers to assign a probable gender, though she flagged that designation as uncertain, was tall and precise in her movements, with the silver-gray coloration that shifted slightly depending on how the light hit it, like the surface of still water at dusk. Her eyes were a pale luminescent gold, and they were currently fixed on Maya with an expression that the translator was categorizing as engaged attention, and that Maya's own instincts were categorizing as something remarkably close to amusement. "I expected you somewhat sooner," the Ethon said. "Your species is supposedly efficient at improvised action. I began to wonder if I had misjudged." "A beat. You were expecting us?" Maya said. "I left the maintenance access point adjacent to your quarters unlocked," the Ethon said. "I also ensured that the surveillance mapping for this corridor section was flagged for routine calibration, which removes active monitoring for 4-hour intervals." She tilted her head slightly. "Please come in." Her name, rendered in translatable form, was something that the translator offered as Vessel of Consideration, or She Who Weighs, neither of which felt like a workable name for ongoing conversation. She told them to call her VS, which she said was the shortened form used by those she worked with. Her quarters were more comfortable than the human delegations, larger, with furniture adapted for Ethon physiology, which turned out to include a preference for elevated surfaces and ambient light at a slightly different spectrum than the corridor standard. She had modified the lighting herself, she said, because the station's default spectrum gave her headaches. "You have headaches?" Sophia asked before Maya could redirect. "Every species with a nervous system has some version of the headache," VS said, with what the translator categorized as dry humor. "It is one of the few things the galaxy has in common." She gestured them to whatever they found comfortable to sit on, and then she stood. Ethon apparently did not sit in conversation. Another cultural note Maya filed away, and she said, "I will be direct because I understand that your time window here is approximately 3 hours before your absence from your quarters is likely to be noted. So let me tell you what I know, and then you can decide what to do with it." "Please," Maya said. "The Kreth proposed Class 7 for your species," VS said. "This is not unusual," The Kreth make this proposal for most newly contacted species below a certain power threshold. What is unusual is the specificity of the language they used. Pray. That word was a deliberate choice. Class 7 has formal terminology. The Kreth went off protocol to use that word. Why? Maya asked. Because they wanted to see how you would respond, VS said. The word is a provocation. It has historical weight. It refers back to a period in the Council's early history when weaker species were formally designated as resource assets for stronger ones. That designation has been formally abolished for approximately 800 years. Using it in open session is an aggressive act. It was designed to produce a response from your delegation. They wanted to see if we would beg, Daniel said quietly. It was not quite a question. They wanted to see if you would submit, VS said. If you accepted the designation without challenge, it would suggest a disposition toward compliance, which makes a species easier to manage as a client state or resource colony. If you responded with aggression, it would confirm the military threat assessment and justify more restrictive classification measures. And if we responded the way Maya did? Sophia asked. Visa's gold eyes moved to Maya. That was the option they did not plan for, she said. A rational, articulate, unsubmissive response that neither begged nor threatened. A response that reframed the terms of the assessment entirely. Did it work? Maya asked. It created sufficient disagreement within the Council that the classification vote was delayed, VS said. That is more than any newly contacted species has managed in the past 200 years. But, she paused. You should understand what the Kreth will do next. Tell us, Maya said. They will push for a revised assessment, VS said. The extended review is not a reconsideration. It is an opportunity for the Kreth to build consensus behind a modified classification, something that maintains their intended outcome while accounting for the legal challenge that would arise from the old prey designation. They will likely propose Class 6 instead. What is Class 6? Dr. Okafor asked. Quarantine status, VS said. A species that is judged to pose a potential threat but is not yet sufficiently developed to require direct neutralization. Class 6 means your species is prohibited from expanding beyond your current territorial boundary. All contact is managed through Council intermediaries. Your technological development is monitored and, if it exceeds approved parameters, subject to intervention. Intervention meaning what? Daniel asked, his voice carefully level. Meaning they can legally destroy your technological infrastructure, VS said. Set your development back by whatever amount is deemed appropriate. Under the justification of Council security. The room was very quiet. They would bomb us back to the Stone Age, Daniel said. It has happened before, VS said. To 3 species in the past 400 years. 2 of them recovered. 1 did not. Maya breathed. She counted. 1, 2, 3. Why are you telling us this? She asked. VS looked at her steadily. Because I have spent 40 years arguing in this chamber that the classification system is broken, she said. That it was built by the powerful to protect the powerful and has never, in its entire history, genuinely served the species that most needed serving. And in 40 years I have made very little progress. Because the Council responds to arguments the way most political bodies respond to arguments, which is to say, it mostly does not. She paused. But the Council responds to power, she said. It always has. And you, Commander Chin, your species has power that you do not yet fully understand. Not military power. Not yet. Something more fundamental. What? Maya asked. The power of a species that has decided it will not accept an outcome, VS said. In my experience, which is considerable, that is the most dangerous thing in the known universe. More dangerous than weapons. More dangerous than numbers. A species that has collectively decided that a certain outcome is not acceptable and is willing to do whatever it takes to prevent it. She looked at Maya. Caro, she said. The word was in the station's common tongue. A word that the translator rendered as meaning something close to from this point, or starting now. What do you intend to do? Maya told her the truth. Not because she had decided VS was completely trustworthy. In this environment, with this much at stake, complete trust was something she could not afford. But because partial truth was worse than full truth in a negotiation, and because her instincts, which had been right often enough that she had learned to listen to them, told her that VS was not lying about her motivations. We are going to contact Earth, Maya said. Whatever the deliberation produces, whatever the Council decides, our government needs to know what is happening here. They need to know about the classification system, about the Class 6 proposal, about all of it. Your communication capability is restricted, VS said. The station's communication array requires authorization for external transmission. We have our own communication system on the Meridian, Maya said. It is short-range for interstellar purposes, but we have a relay network. She looked at Daniel. He gave a slight nod. We can get a message home. It will take time to receive a response, but we can transmit. The deliberation period is 5 days, VS said. Standard for a contested classification. Then we have 5 days, Maya said. And I want to use them. You said the council responds to power, not arguments. I want to build a coalition. Whatever species in this chamber are disposed toward a different outcome for us. I want to understand who they are and what it would take to get them to speak. VS was quiet for a moment. There are 7 species, she said finally, who have previously voted against restrictive classification measures in council sessions. 3 of them are here at this session. The Ethon, she indicated herself, the Solin and the Drethvar. Can you arrange contact? Maya asked. The Solin are cautious, VS said. They are unlikely to openly commit to anything before the deliberation concludes. But they can be persuaded to abstain rather than vote against you, which is effectively the same outcome, given the mathematics of the council vote. She paused. The Drethvar are a more complex proposition. Why? Dr. Nair asked. They are the ones who confirmed the Article 44 ruling, VS said. Which tells you something about their disposition. But the Drethvar have a long history with the Kreth. An adversarial history. Their support for your classification challenge may be less about sympathy for your species and more about opposing the Kretha's influence. Either way, they vote in our favor? Daniel said. Politically, yes, VS said. But you should understand the distinction. An ally who supports you because your cause aligns with theirs is a reliable ally. An ally who supports you because it inconveniences their enemy is reliable only as long as your cause remains useful to that purpose. I understand the distinction, Maya said. She thought about the United Nations. She thought about international politics on Earth, about the alliances built on shared interest versus the alliances built on shared enemies. We'll take both kinds. We can work with both kinds. Visa's gold eyes held a quality that Maya's translator categorized as approval, and that Maya's own read categorized as something warmer than that, something almost like respect. Then let us begin, VS said. The next 3 days were the most complex diplomatic operation Maya had ever been part of. They moved through Vareth Station in small groups, using the maintenance corridors and Visa's extensive knowledge of the station's monitoring blind spots. They met with representatives of the Solin, a species who communicated primarily through a combination of color pattern shifting and secondary vocalizations, making every conversation a fascinating exercise for Dr. Nair and her translation protocols. They met, briefly and carefully, with a representative of a species called the Mendrath, who were not on Visa's original list but who, it turned out, had their own grievances with the Kreth classification system and were quietly willing to make their position known through procedural means. The Drethvar were the most interesting meeting. They were the species with the thick armored plating and powerful limbs that Maya had observed in her first hour in the council chamber, and they were, in person, the most physically imposing beings she had been in close proximity to since arriving on the station. Their lead representative was named something that the translator rendered as First Voice of the Third Assembly, and who told them to use the shortened form, which was simply First. First received them in a space that was more fortress than quarters. Every surface in the room was reinforced, every piece of furniture built to an industrial standard. First moved with a deliberate economical physicality that reminded Maya, unexpectedly, of certain military people she had known on Earth. People who were always aware of every exit in a room, every possible threat vector, every physical variable of the space they occupied. First looked at Maya for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Your response in the council chamber was interesting." "I'm glad," Maya said. "I did not say it was good," First said. "I said it was interesting. There is a difference." "I know," Maya said. "What would you need to see to consider it good?" Another long pause. "The Kreth have been accumulating influence in this council for 200 years, First said. They use the classification system to build client relationships. Species that are classified as Class 6 or below become dependent on Kreth-approved intermediaries for any external contact, which means Kreth-controlled trade, Kreth-approved technology, Kreth-determined resource access. They have been building a dependency network disguised as a protective structure. And you want to break it, Maya said. I have wanted to break it for a long time, First said. The difficulty is that the Kretha's network is extensive. Any direct challenge requires a coalition that is large enough to override their accumulated support in the council. I have not been able to build that coalition because the Kretha's client species, the classified ones, cannot speak freely in council sessions. Their votes are managed. Maya thought about this carefully. If we are classified as Class 6, she said slowly, we would become part of that system. Yes, First said. But if we challenge the classification successfully, she said, we set a precedent that affects every current classification. Potentially, First said. The Council's historical decisions are difficult to retroactively reverse. But a successful challenge to the Kretha's proposed classification for your species would create a legal framework that could be used by other species to challenge their own classifications. You want us to be the test case, Maya said. I want the Kreth to be successfully challenged, First said. Your species is the current opportunity for that challenge. But I will be honest with you, Commander, the Drethvar's support for your position is contingent on that challenge succeeding. If it fails, we lose nothing by having supported you as long as we are careful about how we express that support. But if it succeeds, then the Kreth lose influence, Maya said. And the Drethvar gain it. Yes, First said simply. He did not apologize for that. Maya respected the honesty. Then let us make sure it succeeds, she said. On the fourth day something unexpected happened. Maya was back in the human delegation's quarters. They had returned each night to maintain the appearance of compliance, when a communication came through the Meridian's relay. It was from Earth, from the UN Emergency Council, and it had been transmitted with a level of encryption that told her this was not a routine response. She read it alone, in the small sleeping space that served as her private room with the door closed. The message was from General Briggs back on Earth. It was terse, as his communications always were, but the terseness was doing a significant amount of work. We received your transmission. Full briefing distributed to Security Council and Emergency Government Coalition. Response attached from Full Coalition. The attached response was not from Briggs. It was from the Emergency Coalition of Nations, essentially the closest thing Earth had to a unified planetary government, assembled in the past 2 weeks as the full scope of the Council situation became clear. Read. Commander Chin. The nations of Earth have reviewed your assessment of the situation at Vareth Station, including the proposed Class 7 and Class 6 classifications and their implications. After full consultation, the following resolution has been adopted unanimously. We do not accept the Galactic Council's authority to classify, restrict, or designate the human species in any capacity without our informed consent. We do not accept any restriction on our territorial expansion, technological development, or external contact that we have not agreed to. We do not recognize the legitimacy of any classification imposed without our participation in the process. You are authorized to communicate this position to the Galactic Council in whatever terms you judge appropriate. You are authorized to form alliances and coalitions as necessary. You are authorized, if circumstances require it, to make clear to the Council what the consequences of an unfavorable classification will be. And Commander Chin, if they ask you what those consequences are, tell them. Maya read the last line 3 times. Tell them. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she folded the message, tucked it into the inside pocket of her jacket, and went to find Daniel. We need to talk, she said. He looked at her face and said immediately, what happened? Earth responded, she said. And I need your military assessment of something. What? She told him what Earth had authorized. She told him about the resolution. She told him about the last line. Daniel was quiet for a long time. Can we actually back it up? She asked. If we tell them there will be consequences, if we tell them humanity will not accept this, do we have the ability to make that mean something real? Daniel thought about it the way he thought about everything, precisely, methodically, without drama. The Meridian is a research vessel, he said. But she has 4 defensive arrays that were installed under the cover of standard research protection systems. She could make a significant statement in a confrontation. One ship, Maya said. One ship that they cannot fully classify, Daniel said. Because we've never shown them our full technical specifications. They don't know what the Meridian can do. Which means they don't know what we can do. And uncertainty in a confrontation situation. He paused. Uncertainty is a significant force multiplier. We're not starting a war, Maya said. That is not the intention. The intention is to make clear that a war is a possible outcome of the wrong decision. There's a word for that, Daniel said. I know the word, Maya said. The question is whether this situation calls for it. He looked at her steadily. If they classify us as Class 6, he said, they will eventually act on it. You know that. VS told us. 3 species. 2 recovered. 1 didn't. If we do nothing, we are gambling that we're in the lucky majority. And if we issue the deterrent and they call the bluff? Maya asked. Then we find out what humanity is actually made of, Daniel said. Pause. We already know what humanity is made of, Maya said. Yes, Daniel said. We do. She nodded. Get me to the council chamber, she said. I need to speak before the deliberation concludes. The council chamber on the 5th day was different. Maya could feel it the moment she walked in, a quality to the attention in the room that had not been there before. The news had moved, as news does, through informal channels and quiet corridors and the universe's equivalent of rumor and whisper. Species that had looked at the Sol 3 delegation with bland administrative indifference 4 days ago were now watching with something more active. She walked to the center floor with Daniel and Sophia beside her. The rest of the delegation was in the seats, positioned to observe. VS was in the Ethon section. First was in the Drethvar section. The Solon representative, a being of constantly shifting color whom Dr. Nair had named, privately, Rainbow, was in the Solon section. The Kreth representative looked down from his elevated position. The presiding officer, a species Maya had not spent much time analyzing, an ancient-looking being who moved as though the air itself was slightly deferential to them, called the session to order. The deliberation period for the Sol 3 classification is concluded, the presiding officer said. The council will hear a revised proposal from the Kreth, followed by any counter-proposals from registered speakers, followed by the classification vote. Maya noted that she had been registered as a speaker. VS had handled that. The Kreth representative stood. The Kreth propose a revised classification for the Sol 3 organisms, he said. Based on extended review of the assessment data and accounting for the behavioral profile demonstrated during the initial classification session, the Kreth revised their proposal from Class 7 to... He paused. The pause was theatrical. Maya had spent 4 days around alien beings and she was already learning that some behaviors were universal. Class 6. Quarantine status. Sol 3 organisms are assessed as a potential destabilizing influence on the galactic community and are hereby proposed for restricted development, territorial containment, and monitored contact. He sat down. The presiding officer said, registered counter-proposals. First speaker. Sol 3 delegation, VS said from the Ethon section, before the presiding officer could finish. The presiding officer made a gesture that apparently meant, proceed. Maya stepped forward. She stood in the center of the chamber and she breathed, and she thought about everything that had brought humanity to this exact moment, all of it, the whole improbable, messy, brilliant, flawed, extraordinary history of a species that had started as something small and cold and frightened on a planet at the edge of an unremarkable galaxy and had slowly, stubbornly, at tremendous cost and with tremendous determination, built its way up to this, standing in the largest room in the known universe and being told again that it was not enough. She thought about every person who had been told they were not enough. She thought about what those people had done with that verdict. She spoke. The Sol 3 delegation rejects the proposed Class 6 classification, she said. A murmur through the chamber. We reject it, she said again clearly so every translation system in the room could catch it, on the grounds that it was produced through a process that was designed from the beginning to reach a predetermined conclusion. We reject it on the grounds that the assessment on which it is based was conducted without our knowledge or consent over a period of 112 years. We reject it on the grounds that a classification system that has no mechanism for the input of the species being classified is not a legitimate governance system. It is a management system. And the difference matters. The Kreth representative's illuminated eyes were fixed on her. We also reject it, she said, on the grounds that it is wrong. Classification determinations are not subject to objection on grounds of, the Kreth representative began. I'm not objecting, Maya said. I'm informing. Silence. The human species has received communication from our government, she said. A resolution passed unanimously by the coalition of nations that governs our planet. I am authorized to read it into the official record of this session. She read the resolution. She read every word, clearly, in the ordered quiet of the chamber. She read the part about not accepting the Council's authority to classify without consent. She read the part about rejecting territorial restrictions and technological monitoring. She read the part about not recognizing classifications imposed without participation. And then she read the last part. The nations of Earth authorized their delegation to make clear to the Galactic Council what the consequences of an unfavorable classification will be. She paused. I will now fulfill that authorization, she said. She looked up at the chamber. All of it. Every species. Every representative. Every being who was watching this moment with whatever version of attention their biology permitted. If the Galactic Council imposes a Class 6 classification on the human species, she said, humanity will treat it as an act of aggression. The chamber erupted. Not in sound, in motion. Dozens of species moved simultaneously in whatever way their physiology expressed sudden intense reaction. The presiding officer made several gestures that Maya suspected were calls for order. The translation systems lit up with simultaneous transmissions that the priority algorithm was struggling to manage. Maya did not move. She stood in the center of the floor and she waited for the chamber to settle, and when it settled enough for her to continue, she did. I want to be clear, she said. Humanity is not threatening war. We are explaining a position. The position is this: you have classified other species without their consent. You have imposed restrictions on them without their agreement. You have managed them, contained them, and in at least one documented case, destroyed their technological infrastructure to ensure their compliance. You have done all of this under the authority of a governance system that was built by the most powerful species in this galaxy to benefit the most powerful species in this galaxy. And you have called that system law. She took a breath. We are telling you today that this system does not have authority over us, she said. Not because we are more powerful than you. Not because we think we can defeat you in a direct confrontation. We are a young species and we understand our limitations. But because a law that you did not agree to and that was not designed in your interest has no moral claim on your compliance. And humanity is a species that has, throughout its history, recognized that distinction. She looked at the Kreth representative specifically. You called us prey, she said. I told you then, and I am telling you now, in the official record of this session, we are not prey. And any species that attempts to treat us as prey will find that the attempt has consequences they did not include in their assessment. Not because we will be able to overwhelm you immediately, but because we will not stop. We do not stop. That is the behavioral pattern your assessment actually identified, and that is the conclusion you should have drawn from it. We adapt. We recover. We learn. And we do not accept the verdict that we have lost. She stepped back. The Sol 3 delegation respectfully requests that the Council vote to reject the Class 6 classification, she said, and instead establish humanity as an independent developing species with full rights of self-determination, pending formal treaty negotiations. If the Council is willing to engage with us as equals, we are genuinely, sincerely willing to engage. We have a great deal to learn from this community, and perhaps in time we will have things to offer it. She looked up at the chamber one more time. But we will not be managed, she said. That option is not available. She walked back to her seat. The chamber was, for the longest moment Maya had experienced since arriving at Vareth Station, completely silent. Then first the Drethvar stood up. The Drethvar support the Sol 3 counter-proposal, he said. Then VS stood up. The Ethon support the Sol 3 counter-proposal, she said. Pause. The Salin representative shifted through 3 rapid color changes and emitted a brief sequence of secondary vocalizations. Dr. Nair beside Maya translated in a whisper, the Salin, abstain. Which, as VS had explained, was effectively the same as support. 2 more species, which Maya did not recognize and had not been in contact with, announced support. The Kreth representative was very still. The presiding officer called the vote. The vote was not a victory. This was the first thing Maya had to communicate back to Earth, and she chose her words with great care when she did. The Council did not accept the full counter-proposal. The classification as an independent developing species with full rights of self-determination, that portion failed. The Kreth had enough influence, enough allied votes, enough client species whose managed votes went where the Kreth directed them to block the ideal outcome. But the Class 6 classification also failed. The vote was 41 in favor of Class 6, 38 against, with 12 abstentions. A majority. But not a supermajority, and, Maya learned from VES in the urgent hushed conversation they had in the corridor immediately after the session. The Council's rules required a supermajority for any classification that carried punitive restrictions on a species' development. 60%. The Kreth had 41 votes. They needed 53. They had 12 short. The result was a procedural outcome that the presiding officer announced in terms so formally neutral that they managed to make a significant political event sound like a mildly inconvenient scheduling change. The Sol 3 classification was tabled pending further assessment. The human species was placed in what was called preliminary observation status, neither classified nor unclassified, which meant neither protected nor subject to restriction. Legally they were in a gray zone. Practically speaking, VS explained to Maya afterward, her gold eyes carrying something that might have been cautious optimism, you are in a better position than you were 5 days ago. The Creth cannot act against you while you are in preliminary observation status without triggering a full council review. And a full council review, given the vote distribution today, would not go in their favor. How long does preliminary observation status last? Maya asked. Indefinitely, VS said. It requires a council consensus to change. Given the current distribution of votes, achieving that consensus will be difficult for either direction. So we're in limbo, Daniel said. You are in a position that no species has been in for 400 years, VS said. You are technically unclassified. In the history of the Council, that has never been a comfortable position for the species involved. But it is also, currently, the most defensible position available to you. She paused. I would suggest, Commander Chin, that your species use the time it provides wisely. Use it for what? Maya asked. To make yourselves impossible to classify, VS said. To make yourselves too complex, too connected, too present in the galactic community to be managed by a simple label. To build relationships. To develop. To make any council member who votes against you look less like they are managing a risk and more like they are making a powerful enemy. She looked at Maya steadily. The Creth had 12 votes too few today, she said. In 10 years, if your species does what I believe it is capable of doing, that number will be larger. In 20 years, I believe the vote would go the other way entirely. 20 years, Maya said. For a species your age, VS said, that is almost nothing. The Meridian departed Vareth Station 6 days after the vote. The departure was watched. Maya was told this by the sensor officer as they cleared the station's immediate zone. They were being tracked by at least 11 different monitoring systems from 11 different species. Some of those were council monitoring, standard procedure. Some were not. We have an audience, she said. We've had an audience since we arrived, Daniel said. The difference is that now some of them are watching us for different reasons. The Meridian was quiet as they began the journey home. The tension that had stretched across the entire mission had not disappeared. It had changed character, shifted from the acute terror of the immediate situation to something longer and deeper, the kind of sustained attention required for a challenge that was measured not in days but in years. Sophia sat beside Maya in the observation deck as Earth's sun became visible on the long-range display, still distant, still just a point of light among points of light, but recognizable, familiar. Caro, Sophia said softly. From this point. From this point, Maya agreed. What do we tell them? Sophia asked. When we get home. When they want to know, did we win? Did we lose? What do we say? Maya thought about that for a long time. We tell them we survived the first round, she said finally. We tell them that the galaxy knows we exist. We tell them that the galaxy knows we are complicated and we are not going to be easily managed, which is the most important thing we could have communicated. And the war? Sophia asked quietly. You told them there would be consequences. I told them there would be consequences, Maya confirmed. That was not a lie. There will be. If they push, if the Creth push, there will be consequences. She paused. But the consequences don't have to be military. Not yet. Not as the first option. And as a last option? Sophia asked. Maya looked at Earth's sun on the display. As a last option, she said, we are the species that invented the concept of last resort as a formal category. We understand what it means and when it applies. Sophia was quiet for a moment. I've been writing, she said. During all of it. In my notebook. I know, Maya said. What have you been writing? Everything, Sophia said. What it looked like. What it felt like. What you said. What it means. She paused. When we get home, people are going to want to understand what happened out there. The facts are important. But the feeling of it, that's what determines how people respond. How they prepare. How brave they're willing to be for whatever comes next. Will you publish it? Maya asked. Every word, Sophia said. Every single word. They arrived home to a planet that had been awake for a week. Not literally, people had slept because humans need sleep and the news, while world-altering, had not suspended biology. But collectively, in the way that a society is awake or asleep to a challenge, Earth was awake. The classified leaks had become public knowledge before the Meridian even cleared the outer solar system. By the time they were landing, every news organization on the planet had been running continuous coverage for 5 days, the United Nations was in a special session that had been running non-stop, and there were demonstrations in major cities on 6 continents. Some celebratory, some frightened, some something else entirely, something Maya recognized from her years of working in crisis zones as the particular energy of people who have understood that something significant has happened and are deciding collectively what to do about it. The briefings were immediate and extensive. Maya spent 3 days going through official sessions with governmental and military representatives before she was allowed to sleep for more than 4 hours at a stretch. She answered every question with as much precision as she could manage while running on inadequate sleep and the particular emotional aftermath of having done something she was not fully sure she had the right to do. She had spoken for all of humanity. She had made commitments on behalf of a species. She had looked at a chamber full of alien civilizations and told them what humanity was and what humanity would do. She hoped she had gotten it right. General Briggs, in their first private meeting, looked at her across a conference table with his complicated eyebrows in their full complicated activity, and said, "You told them there would be consequences." "I did," Maya said. "That was not in the briefing parameters," he said. "No," she agreed. "It was in the authorization from the Emergency Coalition. The last line. Which said to tell them what the consequences would be," he said. "Not to define what those consequences specifically are. The consequences are that humanity will not accept the classification," Maya said. "That is what I communicated. The form those consequences take depends on what the Council does next. I did not specify military action. I did not threaten specific retaliation. I communicated a disposition." Briggs looked at her for a long moment. "You know what you actually did?" he said. It was not quite a question. "I deterred them," Maya said. "Yes. With a bluff," he said. "With an accurately communicated intention," she said carefully. "If the Kreth push hard enough, if they act against us, humanity will respond. That is not a bluff. That is a description of what humans do when someone acts against them." Briggs's complicated eyebrows resolved into something simpler. "Yeah," he said. "That's true." He stood up and extended his hand, which surprised her. Briggs was not a handshake man in most circumstances. She shook it. "Good work out there, Commander," he said. The Emergency Coalition's response to the full briefing was, predictably, complicated. The primary response was preparation. Within 30 days of the Meridian's return, the Coalition had authorized the largest coordinated science and defense program in human history. Not a war program, yet, but a development program of a scope that humanity had never mounted before, driven by a shared motivation that had, until now, been insufficient to produce genuine global cooperation. They now had a very specific, very clear shared reason to cooperate. The program was formally called the Unified Development Initiative. Informally, it was called the Response. The Response directed resources from every major nation towards 6 parallel tracks: advanced propulsion, defensive systems, xenobiological study, communication and translation technology, intelligence gathering about Galactic Council operations and, notably at Sophia's insistence, backed by a coalition of cultural organizations, a track dedicated to what was officially titled, Extraterrestrial Diplomatic Capacity, and unofficially referred to as, Learning How to Talk to Aliens Without Inadvertently Starting a War. Sophia led that last track herself. The resource allocation involved every major economy on Earth, all of them contributing at a percentage of GDP that had previously been considered politically impossible. 3 weeks after the briefing, it became possible because the populations of those countries, the people who elected the governments that made the decisions, had understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that the universe contained entities who had spent a century watching humanity and had looked at everything they saw and reached for a label that meant something to be owned. The fundraising, as it turned out, was not difficult. Maya spent the first year back on Earth between briefings and consultations and the particular, exhausting work of being the public face of an event that the entire species needed to process. She gave speeches. She answered questions. She sat in studios and in parliamentary chambers and in school gymnasiums and in community centers in cities she had never visited before, and she answered the same questions in many different forms. What are they like? Are they going to attack us? What do we do? She answered each version honestly, which meant the answers were complicated. The aliens were not one thing, they were dozens of different things, dozens of different species with different interests and different relationships to power and different histories with each other that she was still learning. Some of them were frightening. Some were interesting. Some had looked at humanity with what she would only describe as curiosity, a quality that transcended biology when you knew how to recognize it. No, they were not going to attack. Not immediately. The legal and political constraints were real, and the Council moved slowly as large political bodies do. What do we do? That question she answered the same way every time. We prepare, she said. Not just militarily. Comprehensively. We become the species that cannot be easily managed. And we do it fast. Dr. Nair disappeared into the Xenolinguistics program for 2 years and emerged with the most comprehensive universal translation protocol ever developed by humans. A system that could handle not just language but paralinguistic communication. Physical gesture, color pattern signaling, electromagnetic modulation, and 17 other communication modes identified from the council session recordings. She named it the Nair Protocol, partly because it was her work and partly, she told Maya over a private dinner, because she wanted her name on something that lasted. Everything we do right now, she said, might be the thing that lasts. For a very long time. I know, Maya said. Does that frighten you? Dr. Nair asked. Maya thought about it. It reminds me to be careful, she said. Which is different from frightened. Dr. Okafor built the first formal xenological research institute. Colonel Daniel Park was promoted 3 times in 18 months and took command of what was officially a Deep Space Rapid Response Unit, and what was, less officially, the first genuine interstellar military capability humanity had ever built. Sophia published her book. It was called HFY, a human account of first contact, and it sold more copies in the first month than any book had sold in the previous decade. It was not a political document, though it became political in the way that true accounts of significant events always become political. It was a human document, a first-person account of what it felt like to stand in the largest room in the known universe and refuse to be small. Every major language. Every reading platform. Within 6 months it was being taught in schools. Within a year the phrase HFY was something that people said, in the original Urdu, in translation, in adaptation. It became a way of marking the moment when a decision was made, when a line was crossed, when a person stopped accepting a verdict they had not agreed to. From this moment, it falls to me. 2 years and 4 months after the Meridian's return, the Kreth moved. Not militarily. Not yet. That would have been too clean, too direct, too easy for the Council to rule on. The Kreth were sophisticated, which was one of the things that made them dangerous. They moved economically. Through their network of classified client species. The species under Class 6 and below, whose external contact was managed through Kreth-approved intermediaries, the Kreth quietly closed trade pathways that were beginning to develop between humanity and several of the more independently disposed species in the galactic community. Humanity had spent 2 years carefully, slowly building informal relationships, knowledge exchanges, communication links, the careful first steps of what might, eventually, become genuine alliances. Nothing formal enough to require council approval. Everything just below the threshold that would trigger review. The Kreth closed those pathways. Not obviously, not in ways that could be easily brought to the council as violations. They used their client relationships, their dependency networks, their long-established influence in the communication infrastructure of the medium-tier galactic community. The message being sent was very clear, if not officially stated anywhere. Humanity's attempts to build relationships outside council channels will be obstructed. You cannot form alliances we do not approve. You cannot connect to the community we do not sanction. You are isolated whether you accept the classification or not. Maya was briefed on this by VS, whose communication with the Sol 3 delegation had become a regular, carefully managed exchange over the 2 years since the session. VS communicated through a relay system that was not the standard council infrastructure. A private network that she had been maintaining for years for exactly this kind of situation. The Kreth are testing the boundaries of preliminary observation status, VS said. What they are doing is not technically prohibited, because it operates through private relationships rather than official channels. But the effect is the same as a formal restriction. Can we challenge it? Maya asked. At the next council session, VS said. Which is in 14 months. 14 months is a long time for a blockade, Maya said. It is not officially a blockade, VS said. No, Maya agreed. But that's what it is. There was a pause in the transmission. The Drethvar have noticed, VS said. First has communicated that the Drethvar consider the Kretha's action an overreach. They are considering raising it at the next session. That helps, Maya said. It is not sufficient, VS said. The Kreth know they are overreaching slightly. But, slightly, is calibrated, they've done this before. The overreach is never quite enough to trigger a formal response. Maya thought. What would trigger a formal response? She asked. Pause. If the overreach affected a council member of sufficient status, rather than an unclassified peripheral species, VS said carefully. Another pause. The Ethon, Maya said. I have no idea what you mean, VS said in a tone of voice that Maya's translator tagged as deliberate neutrality, and that Maya's own red tagged as exactly what I think it means. The Ethon have established communication links with humanity, Maya said. If those links were disrupted through Kreth influence, that would be an action against a full council member, VS said. Which would require a formal council review. which would put the Kretha's full network of influence under examination, Maya said. Potentially, VS said. How do we make that happen? Maya asked. The Ethon would need to make a formal attempt to establish a communication link through a channel that the Kreth would be motivated to interfere with, VS said. And the interference would need to be documented. Precisely and officially documented. I'm going to need Daniel on this, Maya said. I would recommend it, VS said. What followed was 60 days of what Maya privately thought of as the most complicated game of chess she had ever played, conducted over interstellar distances, with moving pieces that included 2 alien species, the communication infrastructure of a galactic governance body, and the collected intelligence-gathering capability of human civilization's brand-new interstellar affairs apparatus. Daniel ran the intelligence operation. He was very good at intelligence operations. The Ethon, through VES, with careful deniability, attempted to establish a formal communication link with Earth through a mid-tier relay station that was technically neutral but practically within the Kretha's influence sphere. The attempt was documented from the Earth side with the full recording capability of the NAIR protocol communication systems. The Kreth moved to block it. The block was subtle. It always was. But Daniel's team had been watching for exactly this kind of subtle move, and they documented every step of it, every redirected signal, every managed intermediary, every piece of private relationship leverage used to make the link technically malfunction, without anything official being recorded anywhere. They built a case. Not a legal case, not yet. A political case. A document that showed, precisely and with full technical evidence, how the Kretha's influence network operated, how it was being used to isolate humanity, and how, in the process of doing so, it had interfered with the communication rights of a full council member in good standing. VS took the document to the council through a procedure Maya had not known existed, an emergency petition mechanism that required a minimum of 5 supporting council member signatures and triggered a mandatory review session within 60 days. She got 8 signatures. The 4113th session of the Interstellar Assembly was different from the 4112th in ways that Maya noticed the moment she entered the council chamber. 2 years ago, the Sol 3 delegation had been placed in mid-tier seating. This time they were placed 6 rows higher. Not at the top, nowhere near the top. But the physical positioning of a delegation in this chamber was a communication, and the communication was different from the last time. More eyes were on them immediately. Not the careful, clinical observation of an assessed curiosity. Something more like the attention you receive when a room has been talking about you. Maya recognized, in the positioning of several delegations, species she had not directly spoken with but who had apparently been following the events of the past 2 years. The Mendrath, the species that had quietly supported the procedural countermotion in the first session, were in a different position themselves, 1 row higher than their 4112th placement. The Solon representative, Dr. Nair's rainbow, caught Maya's eye and produced a color sequence that Dr. Nair, leaning close, translated as roughly, "We are interested to see what you do." "That's progress," Maya murmured. "That's significant progress," Dr. Nair confirmed. The emergency petition review was the primary item on the session agenda. The presiding officer, the same ancient-looking being as before, who Maya was beginning to think might genuinely be ancient by any standard, called the session to order and outlined the matter. The emergency petition, submitted by the Ethon delegation and co-signed by 8 council members, alleges systemic interference with council communication rights through the operation of private influence networks in violation of Council Charter Article 12, the right of all council members to establish and maintain communication with any recognized party without interference. The Kreth representative was very still. The petition names the Kreth as the primary responsible party, the presiding officer continued. The Kreth have the right to respond before the review committee is convened. The Kreth representative stood. The Kreth reject the characterization of private commercial and diplomatic relationships as systemic interference, he said. The Ethon's communication attempt was not blocked by any action of the Kreth. Technical difficulties in the relay infrastructure are a known variable. The petition includes full technical documentation of the interference, said a new voice, the Drethvar representative, first, standing in his section, his armored frame giving his words a physical weight that they needed no translation to convey. The documentation is not consistent with technical malfunction. It is consistent with deliberate signal management. The Drethvar move that the documentation be entered into the session record and that the review committee be convened immediately. The vote on that procedural motion was 54 in favor. The Kreth had 41 votes. The review committee was convened. The review took 3 days. Maya used those 3 days. She met with every delegation she could reach, using Visa's guidance, using the expanded knowledge of council procedures that 2 years of intensive study had given her, using the Nair protocol translation systems that let her move through conversations with other species at a rate and depth of communication that would have been impossible on the Meridian 2 years ago. She learned things. She learned that the species called the Solon had been classified as Class 5 for 300 years and had been trying to challenge that classification through official channels for almost all of that time. She learned that the Mendrithus position in the council hierarchy was lower than it should be by any objective measure of their civilization's development, a discrepancy that could be explained by who had managed their classification process, and who had benefited from the outcome. She learned that the Kreth's dependency network was more extensive than even first had described to her. And she learned that the species within that network were not uniformly compliant. Some of them were compliant because they genuinely believed the council's authority was legitimate. But others were compliant because the cost of non-compliance, as it had been presented to them, seemed too high. That was interesting. What happens to a compliance built on fear, when the fear is addressed? She had a theory. She shared it with VS. If the review committee finds against the Kreth, she said, it creates a legal precedent. Not just for communication rights. For the validity of the interference network itself. Potentially, VS said. And if the validity of the interference network is challenged, Maya continued, then every classification that was supported by Kreth-managed votes becomes questionable. The Solon's Class 5. The Mendrithus placement. Every species that was classified in a process where the Kreth had leverage over the outcome. Visa's gold eyes were very steady. That would be the single most significant legal challenge in council history, she said. I know, Maya said. It would take time, VS said. Years. Possibly decades. I know, Maya said again. But the precedent would be set. And once it's set, time does the work. VS was quiet. You came here 2 years ago to get your species out of a classification, she said. I came here 2 years ago to do that, Maya agreed. And I succeeded at the immediate problem. Now I want to solve the longer one. The longer one being? A governance system that has been run by its most powerful members for their own benefit, Maya said. That has called other species prey and imposed restrictions designed to keep them manageable and exploitable. That has used the language of law and order to disguise a structure of dominance. She paused. That problem is not a human problem. That problem belongs to every species in this chamber. We're just the first ones in a long time who've had the standing, or maybe the recklessness, to say it out loud. VS looked at her for a very long time. HFY, she said quietly. The phrase had apparently made its way to VS through Sophia's book, which, Dr. Nair had told Maya with astonishment, had been translated into 11 alien languages through informal channels within 2 years of publication. HFY, Maya agreed. The review committee found against the Kreth. The ruling was specific and technical. The committee identified 4 distinct instances of communication interference that met the threshold for Article 12 violations, and it imposed a formal censure and a requirement that the Kreth divest their management relationships with 14 specific relay stations. The censure was the first formal sanction against the Kreth in 400 years. The chamber received the ruling with a quality of attention that Maya had learned, over the past 2 years, to read more accurately. It was not celebration. That would have been culturally specific and probably inaccurate across species. It was more like the sensation of a pressure change. Something that had been held at a certain state for a very long time shifting, slightly, toward something else. The Kreth representative was very still for a very long time after the ruling. Then he looked at Maya. Maya met his illuminated gaze steadily. The Sol 3 delegation, the Kreth representative said, has been active outside the scope of their preliminary observation status. The Sol 3 delegation, Maya replied, has been talking to people. Which is what people do. The presiding officer intervened, redirecting the session to the required procedural responses to the ruling. But the exchange was on the record. Everything in this chamber was on the record. After the session, walking back through the corridors of Vareth Station with Daniel and Sophia, Daniel said, he's going to escalate. I know, Maya said. The censure cost him something real, Daniel said. The 14 relay stations are a significant piece of his infrastructure. He's going to want to recover that loss. I know, Maya said. So what do? Daniel asked. We continue doing what we've been doing, Maya said. We talk to people. We build relationships. We make ourselves complicated to manage. She paused. And we make sure the Meridian is ready. She is, Daniel said. Good, Maya said. Keep her that way. The escalation came 8 months after the second session. It did not come from the Kreth directly. That was not their method. It came from a species called the Van Rel, a compact, fast-moving species with silver-blue plating and a history of acting as what VS described, with diplomatic understatement, as Creth-affiliated enforcement. 2 Van Rel vessels appeared at the edge of human territorial space without announcement. They did not attack. They positioned themselves, holding station at a distance that was clearly calculated. Far enough to claim non-aggression. Close enough to be understood as a message. We are here. We can reach you. Consider your actions carefully. Maya was briefed from Earth through the relay system. She was at Vareth Station. She had returned for a series of ongoing negotiations that were slow but real, when the news reached her. Daniel, still on Earth, was already managing the military response. The response was not panic. The 2 years of preparation meant that the Rapid Response Unit, 4 vessels, all of them research classified but all of them with the same kind of carefully described standard research protection systems, as the Meridian had carried on the first voyage, was deployed within 6 hours of the Van Rel vessel's appearance. They held a counter position. Not aggressive. Not in the Van Rel's face. But there. Present. Watched and watching. The Van Rel held for 72 hours. Then they departed. Maya spent those 72 hours at Vareth Station watching the Council's response. Or rather, watching the Council's conspicuous non-response. No species formally raised the Van Rel's positioning at the Sol 3 border. No species called it a violation. It was too ambiguous, deliberately so. But VS sent her a quiet communication. 6 delegations have noted the Van Rel's movement in their private logs. 3 have noted that it appears to be Creth-coordinated. None are ready to say so publicly. Yet. Yet, Maya repeated. You are building the coalition, VS said. Slowly. The Creth know it. This was a test of your response capability. Did we pass? Maya asked. You responded proportionally, without aggression, without withdrawal, VS said. In the assessment of a species trying to understand what it is dealing with, yes. You passed. There were 3 more tests over the following year. The Van Rel appeared twice more. A different Creth-affiliated species, the Doroth, small but aggressive, attempted to intercept a human research vessel in neutral space. The intercept was clumsy and the human vessel, running on a new propulsion variant that the Doroth had no data on, simply went faster and left them behind. Each test was met with a response that was proportional, professional, and firm. Each response was watched by the galactic community. And with each response, something shifted. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But Visa's communications became gradually more optimistic in tone. First sent a direct message through official Drethvar channels, the first official Drethvar communication to Earth, expressing what was translated as significant respect for the measured conduct of the Sol 3 defensive response. The Salin, through Dr. Nair's patient relationship building, began sharing technical information. Not militarily sensitive, cultural and scientific. But the act of sharing was the thing that mattered. The Salin had not shared technical information with any unclassified species in 200 years. The Mendrath made formal contact with the Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs and requested an information exchange on atmospheric management techniques, which was both scientifically interesting and politically significant in ways that Maya spent a productive hour explaining to a confused group of atmospheric scientists who had not anticipated being at the center of interstellar diplomacy. In the 3rd year after the first session, the Council convened the 4114th Assembly. The Sol 3 delegation's seating was 4 rows higher than the previous session. Not at the top. Still not at the top. But in a section that, VS had told her, was colloquially known among Council members as the active tier, the species whose voices carried consistent weight in deliberations. The Creth were still there. They were still powerful. Their influence network, though diminished by the censure and the required divestments, was still real. But for the first time in 3 years of engagement with the Galactic Council, Maya looked at the chamber and felt something she had not fully let herself feel before. She felt that the math was working. Slowly. Imperfectly. With setbacks ahead that she could not yet see. But working. She sat in her assigned position in the active tier of the Galactic Council, and she thought about humanity, all of it, from the first hominid who had looked at a dark sky and wondered what was up there, to the first astronaut who had floated in space and looked back at the blue sphere below, to the 12 people in a windowless room in New York who had read a message on a Tuesday and begun a journey that had ended up here. She thought about what humanity was. Not what others said it was. Not the classification. Not the assessment. Not prey, or Class 6, or preliminary observation status. What it actually was. And she thought, complicated, determined, terrifyingly stubborn, and absolutely fundamentally not done yet. The 4116th session of the Interstellar Assembly. 6 years after a Tuesday in New York that had changed everything. Maya was 44 years old. She had gray at her temples now. It had come in fast in the first year after first contact, when the stress and the sleep deprivation and the weight of what she was carrying had expressed themselves in the most visible way biology had available. She had kept it. She had, after brief deliberation, decided that looking like someone who had been through something and was still standing was a more honest presentation than its alternative. The chamber was the same chamber. The same vast circular space. The same concentric rings of seating. The same shadowless light and the same quality of air that smelled like nothing. But the chamber was different. The Sol 3 delegation was seated in the 7th ring from the center. In 6 years they had moved from mid-tier assigned seating to the 7th ring. The 7th ring was in the Council's spatial hierarchy, solidly established territory. Not the innermost rings, which were the domain of the oldest and most powerful species. But established. Present. Not at the edges where newly contacted species sat waiting to be assessed. VS had told her, in the communication ahead of this session, that the last species to move from initial assessment to the 7th ring in less than 10 years was the Drethvar, 400 years ago. The average time was 60 years. You are an unusually fast-moving species, VS had said, in a tone that managed to convey both admiration and something that was probably the alien equivalent of exhaustion on behalf of everyone who had been trying to keep up with them. Daniel was not in the chamber. He was on Earth, commanding what was now a full interstellar defense fleet, 12 vessels, all of them capable of what the Meridian had only gestured toward 6 years ago. He had sent her a message before she departed for this session that read in its entirety, "Go get him, Commander. We've got the door covered." Sophia was in the chamber. She was in the 7th ring, 2 seats to Maya's left, with a new notebook because she always had a new notebook. Her first book had led to 3 more. The series was the best-selling sequence of books in human history, which Sophia found both gratifying and slightly absurd. She had recently begun collaborating with an Ethon historian on a joint account of the period from both perspectives, which Dr. Nair was helping translate and which was going to be, everyone involved agreed, a very complicated editorial process. Dr. Nair was in the chamber. She had been appointed the first director of the Galactic Languages Institute, which she had built from the Xenolinguistics program into a full academic body with satellite facilities at 6 universities on 4 continents. The Nair protocol was now the standard translation system used by every human interstellar mission, and 3 non-human species had formally adopted it for their own communication systems. Dr. Okafor was in the chamber. He was 3 years from retirement and looked more relaxed than Maya had seen him in 6 years, which she thought was probably because his professional predictions, made in the first weeks after first contact when everyone was still in shock, had turned out to be remarkably accurate. "I told you," he had said to her last year at a function she had been too tired to attend but had attended anyway because it was his award ceremony and he deserved the attendance, that the key to this was relationships. Every diplomacy is. The species is different. The challenge is different. The fundamental mechanism is the same. "You told me," she had agreed. "You did the hard part," he had said. "I just told you what to aim for." The item on the agenda for this session, brought by the Ethon, supported by the Drethvar, the Mendrath and 11 other council members, was a formal motion to review the classification system. Not to review a specific classification. Not to challenge a specific decision. To review the system itself. The process. The rules. The mechanism by which the council had, for thousands of years, decided what to do with every species it encountered. The Solon were listed as a supporting co-signatory. That was significant. The Solon had not formally supported a major systemic motion in 300 years. There were 24 supporting signatures in total. The threshold for a systemic review motion was 20. They had 4 more than they needed. The Kreth were going to oppose it. The Kreth had been opposing everything with increasing intensity over the past year, which VS said indicated that they were aware of what was coming and were trying to build counter-coalition. They had 37 votes. They had needed 41 to block the classification 6 years ago. 3 years of sanctions, censures, divestment requirements, and the quiet defection of 2 client species to preliminary observer status had cost them 4 votes. 37 was not enough. Maya sat in her seat in the 7th ring and waited for the session to begin, and she thought about the word Caro. From this point, she had been thinking in terms of Caro for 6 years, every decision framed as a starting point, every outcome treated not as a conclusion but as the conditions for the next action. She thought about the word SYMGHY. From this moment it falls to me. The phrase that had started as her private talisman and had become, improbably, something larger, a phrase that humans said to each other now across languages and cultures and contexts, as a way of marking the moment of decision. She thought about all the moments of decision in the past 6 years. The night on the meridian when she had stood in the center of this chamber and refused to accept a verdict she had not agreed to. The night in Visa's quarters when she had chosen to trust an ally she could not fully verify. The 3-day review operation. The Van Rel tests. The slow, patient, continuous work of building a coalition across species that did not share a biology, a history, or an understanding of the universe, but shared. She had come to believe this fully, with every piece of evidence she had collected over 6 years. A shared interest in a community that was governed by something better than the interests of its most powerful members. The presiding officer called the session to order. The motion was read. The debate began. It lasted 4 hours. Maya spoke. VS spoke. First spoke, his armored physicality giving every word the weight of a geological event. The Mendrath spoke. The Solon representative produced a color and sound sequence so complex that Dr. Nair was still working out the full translation 3 days later, but the broad meaning was unmistakable. The Solon supported the motion, formally and completely. The Kreth spoke. Their argument was detailed, historical, and ultimately the argument that power always makes in defense of its own arrangements. That the system exists for good reasons, that it has served its purpose, that change introduces instability, that the current arrangement, for all its imperfections, is preferable to the uncertainty of what comes next. It was not a stupid argument. Maya listened to it carefully. In some form or another, it was the argument that every entrenched system made when challenged on every world in every species. It was also, she had come to believe, always wrong. Not about the uncertainty was real. But about the conclusion to draw from it. The uncertainty of what comes next is real. The thing to do about that uncertainty is not to preserve the arrangement that produces the most certain misery for the most species. The thing to do is to build the next thing carefully, with as many hands as possible. The vote was called. 53 in favor of a formal systemic review of the classification system. 37 against. 8 abstentions. The motion passed. The chamber did not erupt. It did not cheer or celebrate. The species present were too various, too experienced in their own ways with the complexity of change, to respond to a significant vote the way a human crowd might respond. But there was something. A quality of attention that shifted. A quality of air that felt, to Maya's human senses, slightly different, which was impossible technically, but she felt it anyway, and she thought that was probably what it always felt like when something that has been fixed for a very long time began, very slowly, to move. After the session, in the corridor outside the chamber, VS found her. "You know this is not the end," VS said. "I know," Maya said. "The review will take years. The Kreth will challenge every step. The system will not change overnight, not in anything close to overnight by any measure." "I know," Maya said again. "And there will be other challenges," VS said. "Other species with other interests. Situations we cannot predict. The history of this council is the history of one thing being resolved and 3 more emerging from the resolution." "I know," Maya said. "We have those on Earth too. It's what politics is." "You are not frightened by it," VS observed. Maya considered this honestly. "I am sometimes frightened," she said. "But I'm frightened the way a person is frightened when they're doing something important. Not the fear that stops you. The other kind. The kind that keeps you paying attention." Visa's gold eyes held their quality that Maya had learned over 6 years to read as warmth, a quality that might be different in structure from human warmth, expressed through different biological mechanisms and cultural traditions, but that was, she believed, the same thing in its essential nature. The same recognition, across the profound distance of different biologies, of something shared. "Your species," VS said, "is the most complicated thing I have encountered in 40 years of this work. I say that as the highest compliment I know how to give." "I'll take it," Maya said. They stood in the corridor of Vareth Station, a human and an Ethon, in the aftermath of a vote that would take years to produce its full effects, and they looked at each other with the mutual recognition of people who had been through something significant together and understood that what came next was longer, harder, and more important than what had come before. "Caro," Maya said. "Caro," VS agreed. Sophia found her later, sitting in the observation deck of the Meridian before they departed for Earth. The same observation deck where, 6 years ago, Maya had watched Earth's sun become visible on the long-range display and thought about what to tell the species waiting for her answer. Sophia sat beside her. For a while neither of them spoke. Then Sophia said, "I'm going to write another book." "I know," Maya said. "You always are." "This one is different," Sophia said. "This one is about what comes after the first contact. Not the moment, the years, the work. The way change happens in politics and governance, slowly, through processes that seem inadequate to the scale of what needs to change. The way it happens anyway. That's a harder book to write, Maya said. The important ones always are, Sophia said. She opened her new notebook and wrote something. Maya glanced at it. At the top of the first page, in Sophia's precise handwriting, were 2 phrases. The first was in English, from this moment. The second was in the original, HFY. Beneath it, Sophia had written a single sentence that was the beginning of whatever came next. The galaxy had called them prey. Humanity had looked up and answered. And from that moment, the long, difficult, improbable, essential work of changing the shape of things had begun. Outside the observation deck window, the stars held their positions, ancient, fixed, and full of everything that was still unknown. The Meridian turned toward home, carrying a crew that had been to the largest room in the universe and had stood in its center and refused, in the most human way possible, to be small. Somewhere behind them, the 4116th session continued its work. The vote had been cast. The review had been ordered. The system had begun infinitesimally to shift. Somewhere ahead of them, a planet waited. A species waited. 7 billion people who had looked up at the sky for their entire history and wondered what was up there, and who now knew with the full, complicated, terrifying, electric knowledge of a species that has found out, and were deciding together what to do about it. The answer they were building was not simple. It was not clean. It was not the answer that the most optimistic scenario had hoped for or the most pessimistic had feared. It was a human answer, which meant it was a work in progress, which meant it was ongoing, which meant it was alive. HFY. From this moment, everything. The end.